All right. So now that we've talked about initially exploring a topic, we're going to talk about the next step, which is developing it closer to that of a research question as our goal. So, my first recommendations when you're developing your topic is to make sure that it is what we call researchable. So if this is a brand new idea that no one else has ever thought of, there's not going to be academic work on that topic. So make sure it's researchable. This also connects with the time period. If it's something that is very, very current, there's just not been enough time for there to be academic work and publication on it. If it's interesting, academic research can get a little dry at times, and so if it's a topic that you're interested in, that you're engaged in, it makes the process so much more enjoyable. And then I know I've said this before, but keep checking back. Are we straying away from the assignment instructions? Make sure whatever you're doing will fill whatever your instructor is asking for. So here's that information timeline that I mentioned earlier. So different types of information are created with different time periods related to an event. So the day of an event, whenever there is breaking news, TV news, radio, newspaper, website, social media, information is created. Soon after that, probably the next day, printed newspapers would document it. Within maybe the next week or so, popular newspapers, magazines, things like that would probably be published. A month later, more popular magazines, trade magazines. And then all the way 6 months to a year later, that's when scholarly journals will often publish analysis or scholarly work on a topic related to an event. And then it takes a year or more for some scholarly journals, but definitely books and things like documentary films to be published. And this is important because if you're looking for a book on a certain topic, you may or may not be able to find it depending on the time frame involved. So it's also important to make sure that your research questions are exploratory, unbiased, and narrowed. We've talked about the broadening and narrowing a little bit, but exploratory are questions that cannot be answered with either like a number or a yes or a no. So the example here I have is how many drunk driving incidents happen every year in Utah? The answer to that question is a number. It's an important number, but it's not something you can write a research paper on, a number. In comparison, if you have a question like how can colleges reduce drunk driving incidents on campus, that's exploratory. So we're taking the same topic, but just shifting our question a bit. Bias is the next one. This one is hard. We all have our biases. If you're asking if something is the best or the worst, that's an indication of bias in your question. If you ask about impact, that's a more unbiased way to approach it, and that's what this example shows here. And then how do we solve world hunger? I would love it if you were to solve world hunger in an undergraduate research paper, but that's probably not going to happen. So narrowing that, we could look at something like how can rural communities, that's more narrow than world, in the U.S. reduce food insecurity. So exploratory, unbiased, and narrowed. Sometimes it's hard to come up with a question with the long-term goal of creating an argument. So in this situation, it's helpful to do what we call problematize. So challenge the underlying assumptions in the status quo. So think about things that maybe bother you or annoy you that you see in the world. One of my favorite ones from a past experience was the inaccessibility of some areas of a city for moms with strollers. right? So I want the world to be accessible for moms with strollers. That was an example of me problematizing a situation. So you can ask questions like, who does the status quo benefit? Who does the harm? If it were to change, what would it look like? And how would we get there? So in child psychology, this may look like something about, support for families, for children, services, therapies, something related to education. These are all ideas that come up related to this topic. So one example I thought of related to this course would be something like children as young as 7 are being suspended from school and pushed into the school to prison pipeline. So that is a fact, a topic. To create a research question, we would think about, who does this benefit? Who does it harm? If we were to fix this, what might that look like? And how do we get there? Again, I talked about this a moment ago, but if possible, try to be aware of your bias. If you start your research with the solution, your favorite answer, the thing that you think everyone should do, and then you try and find sources to support your answer, you're doing research backwards and kind of upside down. Try to start with a question, not your favorite answer. Again, talking about the narrowing and potentially broadening of your topic. If you can write a whole book about your research question, it's too broad. If you want to look at something very, very specific to your community, you probably are too narrow. We had a student one time who wanted to research parking at her apartment complex. There's not going to be academic research on that, but maybe residential parking in mid-sized cities, maybe that's a broadening of a way that could be effective here. One thing you can do is tie your questions to specific populations. So sometimes I look at rural communities versus urban communities. Sometimes I look at, Utah versus the United States. You have to find just the right size. It is kind of a Goldilocks type of process. You have to try different things sometimes. So once you come up with a research question, it's time to come up with search terms. So these are the words that you put into a library database to search for research. So these are usually nouns. So pull out the nouns from your research question. Keep in mind that library databases don't read your mind, and they're not very good at identifying synonyms. So sometimes you need to come up with synonyms. My favorite example of this is one time I was researching depression in elderly people, and I was trying to come up with synonyms for elderly because I wasn't getting the results I wanted. And eventually I came up with geriatric patients, and that worked for what I needed. So sometimes if you think of other words that are related or straight synonyms. If it's a topic that you don't know a lot about, you may need to do some background reading. If you're typing in abbreviations or slang into the search fields, you're probably not going to get the best results. Try spelling things out. If you want to research the effects, sometimes you could hypothesize and use that as a keyword. And at most, you probably want to do 2 to 3 keywords at a time. Any more than that will be over the top and you'll just get 0 results. All right, so now that we have a research question, we are going to dive into the databases. I'll see you in the next one.